So, perfectionism, when we talk about it, I want to offer our first guideline um, that when we talk about perfectionism, I want to support you in choosing language that is empowering. And I think when we label ourselves like, I'm a perfectionist, there's a way that we uh, put ourselves in a box, and then it becomes hard to navigate outside of that box because we just identify with it. We identify with this thing that perhaps is frequently not helping us or causing us angst or stress in our life in some way. And this is true for any kind of things that we talk about in this space, rather than labeling yourself as, I'm a perfectionist or I'm a procrastinator or whatever. I'm a type A person, like whatever the things are that you might label yourself. I want to invite you to instead uh, change the languaging a little bit to say something like, oh, I have some perfectionist tendencies. I'm experiencing perfectionist tendencies right now. I'm that perfectionist tendency in me is being triggered right now. Those are some examples. So I'm not labeling myself and therefore limiting myself when I say that. I'm just recognizing that, okay, there's a certain aspect of self that is getting highlighted or triggered or activated in this moment, and I'm aware of it. So I already feel like I have more agency when it's something I can work with. So that little technique in languaging gives us some psychological distance between the thing we're working on and our identity, so that we aren't in a place where we shame ourselves for being this or that or having this tendency or that tendency. It's just like, okay, this tendency's up. So I'm going to be aware of that. And I'm going to show up in a compassionate and a loving way to support that aspect of self. You can watch the full episode on the Brilliance Collective, available now for download in the App Store and Google Play. Might seem like a small thing, but it's actually a important um, opportunity for us to already set ourselves up for having optimum agency. Okay. So I wanted to mention that. So when we think of perfectionism, I want to next take us into looking at what are some of the places that perfectionism might arise from. So if you have something to write with and a journal or paper, this is you may choose to take some notes. I'm just going to have a sip of water and then we're going to go over some of the potential causes of perfectionism. So um, this is a list. It'll be tempting to make it linear in your head. It's probably more complex than that. It's, perfectionism just doesn't breed from one particular place. It, like I said, the society we live in and the cultures we live in uh, certainly amplify or augment perfectionist tendencies with with the media that we consume, for example, and the way we're taught to show up in certain spaces. So, knowing that, know that this list is not linear, but pay attention to maybe places where, in your experience with your own perfectionistic tendencies, where things might uh, resonate for you. So, the first thing we want to talk about is attachment. So, when we're little, when we're children, who's ever raising us, if our attachment with them is threatened, if we are not quote unquote perfect, we may have developed a very understandable and uh, appropriate for that situation pattern to move towards perfectionistic tendencies in order to receive love, support, attachment, in and maybe some very literal ways, like unless you do XYZ right, you can't be here, or you don't get dinner, or whatever. I don't know what the things are that may have been said specifically, but attachment is something that every child is geared towards when they're first born, especially when we're so dependent on who's ever raising us to give us food and shelter and warmth and connection and all the things that we need when we're growing. And if that is somehow threatened, if we are not showing up in a particular way, that could be a place where perfectionism gets bred. Um, Gabor Mate speaks about, he's a well-known author and teacher. He speaks about children having a need for attachment and authenticity. However, if authenticity, like your authentic self, threatens getting attachment's going to win every time as a kid. Like if my daughter, I don't know, has something about her that I reject and it threatens her attachment to me, she may disown that part of herself so that she can secure her attachment to me. So this would probably be one place where, for all of us, maybe who have perfectionist tendencies, there's probably some elements in there where it did get rooted into a way of knowing how, if I do this, then it's acceptable and I get this kind of reward or connection. So notice that. Again, not linear. We don't need to go into hyper analytics about it. This first section is really just to give us some understanding before we go into self inquiry about how we can start making some changes and how perfectionist tendencies show up in us now. This next one is important to acknowledge. Again, I'm not a therapist, so we're not going to go into that lens with it. There's a lot of other people who could speak to this from that level more appropriately than I can. But frequently, perfectionist tendencies can be, in part, a response to some sort of trauma. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold today. So if you think about this, those traumas could be related to attachment, just like I said, like if there was some, oh my gosh, unless I do XYZ in a very specific and perfect way, I'm not allowed, I don't get dinner at night, or I get kicked out of the house. Um, I recall actually, I think Oprah once saying I forget what relative, but she used to live in the South and then was moved up north. And because her skin was darker than the relatives she was living with, she wasn't allowed to stay in the house. And they had her sleep on the porch in the back because she didn't meet those standards. So that's a trauma, right? There's a trauma in her head that, like, wow, I'm not fitting the standard, and I'm literally not allowed in the house because of it. So it can go deep, the trauma response. And one of your coping mechanisms for it might have been to create perfectionist tendencies around something. I don't want to spend too much time there. Again, I'm not a therapist, so please take this with a grain of salt. This is kind of just an umbrella look at some of the places where perfectionist tendencies can tend to arise. I've already mentioned this, but our surroundings and our culture can uh, instigate perfectionist tendencies. Perhaps all of us have some story or another where we got introduced or invited into a community, or maybe you just moved and started a new school when you were younger. And all of a sudden, all the quote unquote cool kids were doing this or looking this way or saying these things or showing up in this way. And that became the new standard to meet in order for you to feel like you belonged. And so you're doing everything you can to fit in. And part of what gets developed there is perfectionist tendencies. Certainly, we don't have to look far. Just pick up, any fashion magazine. And even though there is some more progress happening in terms of inclusivity, far and wide, a lot of those magazines are predominantly white and thin, beautiful, standard people. And that is like a very, very myopic vision for what beauty is. And unfortunately, because that's what we're fed, if you're always fed that and seen like that's what gets praise, that's what gets recognition, that's what gets jobs, that's what gets accepted, and all the other things, you may develop a tendency to try and do that to fit in. As Brene Brown would say, we're trying to fit in, we're trying to belong. But the thing is, when we're trying to fit in, we're doing the opposite of belonging. We're actually not being our authentic selves. So we don't really belong if we're trying to fit in. So noticing our surroundings and our culture might contribute to us creating our perfectionist tendencies. Along with that, seeking validation from others. And I've already mentioned that in several ways, like attachment or wanting to be included or belonging. And then also there's more and more research showing that mental health may have some correlations with perfectionist tendencies. For example, if you have clinical anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder, sometimes depression, you may gear towards perfectionist tendencies as a way of trying to maintain some level of control, to feel more safe in your surrounding. I'm so sorry. I have a blinking light up above me. I'm hoping is not too problematic, but if it gets wonky on us, we're going to shift gears. I'm in a little kid's craft room right now, so you'll have to bear with me and my surroundings here, but hopefully that blinking light's not bothering. I'm looking at the screen. It doesn't seem too bothersome. So those are the causes: attachment, things that, again, it's not linear, but attachment issues, trauma responses, our surroundings, our culture, our need to seek validation and connection with others, and certain mental health concerns might correlate also with perfectionist tendencies. So now I want to ask you our first inquiry, but before I do, I want to point out explicitly so we can notice, do you notice in all the examples I gave how perfectionism was actually a really brilliant thing that you did to create protection for yourself, right? You wanted to feel included. You didn't want to be shamed, humiliated. You wanted to be loved. You wanted to be allowed inside the house in the example I gave. It's actually quite a brilliant coping mechanism to develop to protect yourself. So the inquiry I have for you that I want you to think about, how has your perfectionism tendencies, how have those tendencies for perfectionism protected you? How have they protected you? And, that's something you might want to take and, journal on for a bit of time, more than we have in this space here in this present moment. But I just started let that question percolate in your head. How has my perfectionistic tendencies, how have they protected me? Because when I notice that and I can acknowledge that, then it's like I haven't even really, dug into the answer in any particular way, but I already just hearing that, it's like I'm already having more compassion for myself for the times that I've fallen into those tendencies. Cause like, oh, you know what? I was doing it because that was probably the best I knew how to do in a situation, and it was protecting me. So I already feel more compassion for myself when I think of it in that way. And I hope that that can be something that you can access as well. So let me do this. I'm gonna turn the light off and we'll see if that helps. Okay. So we have a little mood lighting here. I'm sorry it's dark if it's dark. I'll try to lighten it up if I can in the recording at least, but that light was really bothering my eyes, so I apologize for that. That switch there. So after that inquiry is investigated with more depth, I want to share with you something that I think is helpful, and I'll use myself as an example. Finding my right page here. There are different ways perfectionist tendencies can show up. And there's a therapist I follow on Instagram, Jake Ernst is his name. I believe his handle is MSW Jake, Jake. He outlines what he calls 8 different modes of perfectionism. And I found it helpful to go through them. Again, it's not a linear list, but as I'm reading through this list, notice the elements of the tendencies that come up for you. And the reason I want us to get clear on how it's showing up for me, that's going to point me in the direction of the places of me understanding why I step into perfectionist tendencies when I do. You'll see what I mean in a second. We'll talk about it. But this is, again, something you might want to write down in your journal and reflect on if any of these modes or tendencies of showing up feel true for you. And I'm a blend, so I'll give you an example. We're probably all blends, but I'll give you an example once we get through the list. So the first way it might show up is what he calls the climber. A climber is somebody who's feeling driven by success and achievement and wants power and status. And they associate, in order to be perfect, I need to have power and status. So that's kind of like if your perfectionism is hooked into achievement for you, you might have elements of that climber aspect in yourself. The next one he lists is controller. I definitely have this one. So this is one of my blend. You may want to manage, fix anything or everything. There's a feeling of like needing and wanting to be in control. There is a fear of losing control or not being in control. If I can control, manage, and be in charge, then I can avoid danger, I can avoid shame, I can avoid failure, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, this is not necessarily going to be true for everyone who has elements of that tendency, but my perfectionist tendencies are geared towards control sometimes. And for me, it's related to like old trauma response that, well, if I just cover all the bases and I do everything perfectly, then that bad thing can't happen, or I can't get hurt by such and such or so and so. right? So there's that, it's tied into an element of safety for me. And again, that's why that was a brilliant response for a little person to come up with in those situations if it was tied to my safety in some way. Another one he lists is the knower. The knower. And the knower uses knowledge and intellect like currency. If I know all that there is to know, I can avoid shame and criticism. So I'm just going to know all the things. I'm going to read all the books. I'm going to follow all the people. I'm going to watch all the podcasts. I'm going to do that. And then I can't get shamed because I'm going to know more than anybody else in the room. Again, a protection mechanism. I have had parts of that as well show up for me. This next one is called the shower. The shower is someone who feels a need when this aspect's coming up for you. It's a feeling like you need to prove your worth with some big outward display, hiding your imperfections. So when we're in that shower tendency mode, if you have it, it's like you're curating an image of yourself. That might even go down to like who I am seen with in public. What kind of stuff am I putting up online on my social media posts? Does it look right? Does it present the kind of image I want? The idea here being, if I keep it together and I look perfect to whoever it is I'm trying to impress, then no one will notice and see my flaws. Okay. The next one he lists is the hider, like hiding. This one also resonated for me in some regards. The hider stays small and quiet, and they don't bring the attention on them at all, and they work on themselves quietly. And the idea here is if I hide, no one will spot my imperfections. I'm just going to make as little waves as possible. Nobody will see my imperfections. So you might have elements of that as well. Next up, we have the performer. The performer is somebody, I have aspects of this as well when my perfectionist tendencies show up. There's a focus on peak level performance, growth, and optimization are like there's a lot of drive and ambition with the performer. Productivity and mindset will often trump rest and self-care. And I mean, I did that gratefully, I can say I felt kind of good going through this because I've been doing a lot of work on this for so long that a lot of these things are not as nearly as triggering as they used to be, say 20 years ago for me, but they're still there. New flavors of them come up, for example, when I became a parent, but I share that they're different now because I don't want you to feel like you're locked in. If you're recognizing one of these things like, oh my God, that's totally me, it's okay. It's just a tendency. It's a part. It's an aspect of self. It's not a bad part, but we don't always have to let it be in the driver's seat. So we're just noticing that right now. The performer will have this idea of if I hustle and grind, I'll experience less failure and I just keep going. I'm just going to keep achieving and be ambitious. There's two more. Next one is the critiquer. They are always, when we're in this aspect of self, we're always finding flaws with ourselves and others. We're in judgment mode. Judge. Just keep judging. And the idea is, and sometimes this judgment is harsh, but we'll mask it and say it's a form of care because, if I see the flaws first, then I won't be blindsided when other people potentially point it out and I'll be able to fix them, right? So like maybe you've had someone in your life who said like, well, I don't mean to be mean, but I want to tell you this because I don't want you to get rejected by others. But in that judgment there, you're already feeling that rejection. So the critiquer is really focused on judging self and others as a way to preempt any rejection or dismissal from others. They just kind of co-opt it and do it for themselves already. And the last one is the non-starter. This tendency will cause procrastination, risk aversion, stay in that dreaming mode so that you don't actually have to show up and potentially fail. There's just that sense of, well, I'm just not going to do anything and then I'll be safe. Sometimes what I also want to point out with all of these 8, you may have blends of them, like I mentioned, but you also might do them unconsciously, right? You might you might not identify yourself as procrastinating when you're doing it. You may not identify yourself as critiquing, being the critiquer when you're doing it. So, part of why I shared that list with you is so that we can start to become more self aware of the patterns. We're not calling them problems, but the patterns that may show up in ourselves, so that when they show up next time, we can say, oh, you know what? I'm noticing that's the critiquer in me, or that's the knower in me who wants to know everything and be all the things. Do I have a different choice here? Do I have to let the knower take charge, or can I shift gears and choose another perspective? So I found that list really helpful. Again, the guy's name is Jake Ernst. His Instagram handle is MSWJAKE. And it was the 8 modes of perfection that he shared. So I want to take another drink of water. I hope this room isn't too dark for us now. I'm going to move on to some strategies. I'm not an expert here, but I'm very much in process with you. And I'm just going to share with you what I have noticed has helped me and many of the people I've worked with over the last several decades. The first thing I want to point out is a distinction that, if you read my book, there's that there's a brilliance principle in chapter 2 about seek personal excellence and not perfection. So that would be similar to what I'm going to share with you here, is that there's perfection, and then there's what we call excellence or high standards. And how do you tell the difference between them? What does that mean? How does that translate in like the daily life? And so I wanted to just give you some ways to outline the differences there. Perfectionism, mistakes equal failure. And with high standards, mistakes are necessary and accepted, and they actually are signs that we're evolving. And there's a drastic difference there. The focus is with high standards or personal excellence, that mistakes are like, hey, I'm learning. I shared this in the episode I did with Milena in the imagination station this last week. We did a finger weaving exercise, and I was not perfect at it by any stretch of the imagination. And I was telling her about my kid is learning how to write and read because she's in kindergarten, and she's making letters and numbers backwards sometimes. And she would get really upset. Like, she'd write her numbers 1 to 100, or she would try to write her numbers 1 to 100 on one page. And if she did a number backwards, she'd want to take the page out and start all over again and be really upset. And I would just say, no, you can just scratch it out and do that number again and keep going. You don't have to start over from the beginning. And I shared with her the Japanese design principle, which is called wabi-sabi. And it's the idea that when you're making art, there's sometimes imperfections, and that imperfections are actually what make it very beautiful. So like if they have a piece of pottery, for example, that then cracks, a wabi-sabi design principle that you might often see is that in the pottery crack, they'll put this gold liquid that will then firm up, and it becomes this really beautiful part of the pottery, even more beautiful than if it was quote unquote perfect. So I shared that with my daughter, and much to my surprise, she really took to it. And so now when she'll just cross out and she'll just go, wabi sabi, mom, and she'll just keep going. And I love that, because it reminds us that these are learned behaviors and we can unlearn them. So that could be a little technique that you could do there, right there for yourself, to move to a place of personal excellence from high standards, is that the mistakes are actually learning. They're not failure. Perfectionism is also going to have unreachable standards. There's a sense of only valuing outcomes. There's only one right way. Perfectionism is very rigid. The other thing is, when I've been in modes of perfectionism or been steeped in my perfectionist tendencies, And again, I don't really have them nearly as much as I used to, but when I did, they would show up where it was just exhausting. I would often burn myself out because no matter how good or well or perfect I did something, there was always more to do. There was no end goal. It just kept going, and it was had an addictive quality in that way. And you're not going to see that so much in high standards. High standards, you might have ambitious goals, but you also value the process. It's like, I'm not just focusing on what I'm doing, but how I'm being when I do it. And I'm also not going to be so rigid that there's only one right way to do it. With personal excellence, I'm constantly, remember, firm with intention, flexible with form. I'm constantly being malleable and pivoting and figuring out how the situation calls for different forms of brilliance, different forms of creativity to emerge. And that's why we have the imagination station in our app, because we need to exercise those muscles of being creative, of being imperfect, of being in a place of using our imaginations to stay flexible and fluid rather than the rigidity that comes with perfection. And I think the other thing that can help you suss out if you are in a moment, you're like, I don't know if I'm being a perfectionist here or having my perfectionist tendencies here, or if I'm just in my high standard place. This is a useful question to help you ascertain the answer to that. Do your standards in this particular moment, when you're trying to assess if you're coming from that perfectionist tendency or from a place of personal excellence, do these standards I'm holding right now help, or do they get in the way of me achieving my goal? Do these standards I'm holding right now, are they helping me to achieve my goal, or are they getting in the way? So if I don't know, let's say I have a standard of, I cannot go to sleep until this whole house is cleaned, or I cannot go to sleep until this next chapter of the book is written, or whatever. I don't know, whatever the thing is. If I start to notice that there are detrimental effects happening, maybe I'm falling asleep, maybe the work I'm producing is shoddy, maybe I'm starting to experience some physical health issues because I've been running ragged and not listening to self-care or rest boundaries, those might be indicators that I'm in that perfectionist mode. Whereas personal excellence is actually going to encompass this idea of like, hey, I'm an intelligent person and I know that I'm not going to produce the best writing for my next book chapter if I'm operating on 2 hours of sleep. So my personal excellence goal right now is to get those 7, 8, 6 hours of sleep, whatever I can, so that I can perform my best work tomorrow. That's a personal excellence stance. Whereas perfectionism is just going to be like, nope, got to do it. This is the rigid way. This is the only way. It's the only acceptable way. So looking at your standards and seeing if your standards are helping or getting in the way of what your achievable goal is can be an indicator on whether or not you're coming from a perfectionist tendency place or just a high standard place. I hope that was helpful. Just gonna get a Kleenex here, pardon me. Take that in for a moment. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. Another thing I want you to think about is if you notice you're in one of those perfectionist tendency places, like you're becoming more self-aware, you're like, oh, wow, I am doing it again with my kid. I'm putting that perfectionist tendency in gear with her, and I want to press stop. I want to check in, and this would be true for you too, as you notice your perfectionist tendency in whatever situation it's arising. Just check in with yourself. Are you feeling safe in that moment? So, maybe you're in a work environment where, for any variety of reasons, maybe you're of a marginalized identity, you don't feel safe unless you're giving that perfection 110% of the time. Well, that makes sense then why that is still activated, that perfectionist tendency. So if notice if in whatever scenario you're in, if it's connected to a feeling of safety, that's an important thing to be aware of in those moments and then say, okay, so I need to tend to that part of me that feels unsafe because until that part feels grounded and safe, I'm going to keep choosing this perfectionist tendency. So maybe that means doing therapy work with a therapist or work with a coach or both. Maybe that means learning certain somatic techniques to ground yourself in a certain moment. Maybe if, I don't know, you're in a work environment and your perfectionist tendencies get kicked in when you're with this one particular boss, maybe, or one particular person. Maybe you only congregate with that person when others are in the room, so you feel safer emotionally or psychologically or whatever the case may be. I don't know what the specific scenarios will be, but if it's hooked to safety for you in some capacity and you know that, that's the bigger thing we need to work on because the perfectionist tendency is just you trying to protect yourself. And that makes sense to want to do that in a place where you don't feel safe. So if we can address the safety issue, that can start to detach us from the tendencies of perfectionism. It's not something that happens overnight. Sometimes it's complex because we live in systems where, it'd be nice if you could just be like, oh, now I feel safe and I don't have to do any of that stuff, but it's not an even playing field. So this kind of thing might happen more for marginalized individuals. This is why I think you often hear, a person who's marginalized will often have to work twice as hard, if not more, as a person who's not marginalized to just even get acknowledged or even allowed on the playing field, so to speak. So again, these are cultural systemic things, but that's why we don't want to internalize them and we don't want to label ourselves in any particular way. And that's why a big part of what I'm sharing with you today is ways for you to get aware of how your perfectionist tendencies show up and then starting to investigate what's underneath. And in this case, if it's a safety issue, then let's talk about that and let's get you in places where you can get support around feeling safer psychologically or physically or whatever, so that you're not choosing that perfectionist tendency as much. Remember, I asked you, do your standards help or get in the way of you achieving the goal? A follow-up question to that would be, what would happen if you relaxed your standards? That can be a really powerful question in the moment when you are perhaps fully activated in your perfectionist tendencies. I have to check myself in my mothering and my parenting because I want to be the perfect mom that does all the things for my kid and make sure she has everything she wants in terms of her experiences in life. And that's impossible to do. And it doesn't feel good to keep up with. It's exhausting. And to be honest, it's also not a good thing for her to always get everything she always wants in her life in that sense, like something being handed to her all the time. I want her to have some agency and some life experience. So I'm constantly having to check myself because there's a part of me, that perfectionist tendency part of me, will be like, oh, I just want to do all the things for her. And I want her to have only happy times. And I don't ever want her to have a bad experience at school. And I don't ever want her to have this or that. And when I do that, I take away her process. I take away her ability to experience life on her own terms. So a little thing I do for myself, and even if this doesn't have to just be with kids, you could do this anywhere, wherever your perfectionist tendencies kick into gear. I always just observe my first response up here. Like, let's say I have some big task. Oh, I have to put together this party. It's got to be the best party. It's got to have all the foods. I've got to make sure I've got food for all the different dietary restrictions. I've got to do this, da, da, da. Whatever the thing is, notice your first reaction, observe it, press pause, stay curious about it, and then just say a neutralizing phrase that I like to say, that's really interesting. Look what I expect of myself. And now, what if I relaxed that first response or that first expectation of standards? What if I relaxed it even just like 10%? If that feels too scary, even just 1%. Or if I'm feeling bold, like, what if I relaxed it 20%? What if I just did 80% of what I thought I was going to do for this project, this thing, for whatever? And just feel that in your body. What you're starting to do there is you're starting to build your window of tolerance for a different kind of uncomfortable, right? Because being a perfectionist being in a perfectionist tendency space is uncomfortable in a certain way, but it's often a familiar uncomfortable. Not choosing the perfectionist tendencies and moving into this, like, okay, I'm going to do this project, but I'm going to not do X, Y, and Z, which I would normally do. That might really be uncomfortable or hard, but it's going to be the right kind of hard. There's a way when we're building our window of tolerance, when we're trying to deprogram from a lifetime of perfectionism, you're going to want to start with small things. I'm not going to go jump into the hardest area of my life where it's the perfectionist tendencies are in high gear. I'm going to start with small things, like maybe I don't double check that email and there's a typo in it before I send it. I don't know. It could be any myriad of things. Maybe I put a certain meal on the table and I didn't, it wasn't perfect. All the napkins didn't match. I don't know. I don't know what it'll be, but start with things that feel rather inconsequential for you. And then build up from there. Build up from there. And the idea is you're working a muscle. You're working a muscle that if we pull back, it's not the imperfect muscle, it's the authentic muscle. So, a lot of people don't talk about this, but when you step into authentic self or you're on a journey towards your authentic self, that can be emotionally taxing because you've never maybe done it before. And so it's going to feel more vulnerable. It might even have some grief wrapped in it because you'll be like, oh my God, I haven't honored this authentic part of myself, been doing that perfectionist tendency thing for so long that when I honor my authentic self, like it actually makes me feel grief for all the times I didn't do it. So you might have grief in it. You might have emotional withdrawal from the kind of response you get. You might get a certain response when you show up in perfectionist self. And then when you show up in authentic self, you don't get that same response. There might even be a little bit of a withdrawal there. So this is not necessarily going to be a comfortable journey moving away from your perfectionist tendencies. But number one, it's not linear and you don't have to do it all at once. It's not like ripping off a Band-Aid. You're choosing small strategic places where you can practice it. And you can normalize it too. Like maybe you're in group settings and it could be anything. You could be playing board games with somebody or a group of people and somebody gets the wrong answer. Like it could be really empowering to be like, hey, I thought that was the answer too. Like saying something out loud, like owning the quote unquote imperfection out loud. The weird thing a lot of us don't realize is here we are seeking belonging and connection with others. And the very thing that connects us to others is our humanity. Yet when we're doing the perfectionist tendencies, we're shutting down our humanity and we're putting up a mask and we're fronting. And then we're wondering why we feel so isolated and alone because we're quote unquote doing all the right things. We're the good little girl or the perfect little guy or whatever the thing is that we're telling us ourselves. And we're confused why we feel so alone if we're quote unquote doing it all right and perfect. Because that's not what creates connection. That's not what creates it. And again, if you had an attachment challenge when you were little and thought that you had to be perfect to get attachment, that's some deprogramming that's going to take some time to undo. It's not impossible. I can speak from personal experience. Like I am very different in my experiences around perfectionism than I was certainly 20 years ago. But even I would say like pre-pandemic, I actually have a memory from the pandemic, where early in the pandemic, my child was 3 at the time and in preschool, but couldn't be in preschool all of a sudden. And all of a sudden, it was like, okay, I'm homeschooling my kid, and I'm somehow supposed to keep doing my job and keep the house going and homeschooling and yada, yada, like so many other parents in the world. And I just remember talking to somebody, I don't remember who it was, but saying, well, my inner perfectionist, she's over there on the ground, shattered. She died. She's not coming back. And so there's a way, I think we're all coming to a place of reckoning with this on a cultural level. So that's also probably happening for us on an internal level. The thing with perfectionism is it is so relentless that if you just keep showing up in the perfectionism, it will run you until there's no more left. You will burn out again and again and again, and something will happen where you're just not able to do it anymore. And so in a weird way, that was a silver lining of a very difficult time in that early pandemic of recognizing, hey, I can't do it all. I certainly can't do it all perfectly. And I definitely can't do it all. Like, I've got to make some sacrifices and some surrender here. I can homeschool my child, or I can work and stick her in front of a TV, or whatever the things are. And I had to make some choices. And so there was a death of a perfectionism there, but I still struggle with it. So it's not like it's going to, this might be a lifelong contract for you to have to work with the different ways to be with perfectionism. But I think knowing that, and that you're not alone, and also recognizing, like, hey, this is forced on us from so many different angles on a societal level, that all of us have some version of this virus in our system. And we need to step back and be more compassionate with ourselves and each other around it. So I want to share that it's, please lead with compassion in this. The other thing I want to offer in terms of a tangible sort of like tip is, if you've read my book, there's a phrase in there, I use your brain diet. What are you consuming in terms of your media, but also what groups of people you're surrounding yourself with? Who are you spending the most time with? What communities are you engaging in? And when you maybe write all that down on a sheet and look at it and then say, are these things contributing to my perfectionist tendency? Or are these things role models or examples of different ways to be? So, I try to seek out people that I see as role models. For me, I had like the one that in the list that I read, the performer, the peak performance, the optimization, the growth sort of addict. That when that part of me was in super high gear and I became aware of its toxicity for me, I pulled back and I started to find people that didn't bow to the altar of ambition. I didn't need any more examples of how to be super ambitious. And I started to seek out professionals, whether I knew them or not. Maybe I would just listen to their book or podcast or something. But I tried to seek out professionals and individuals and others that could be inspirations and role models for me and how to do it a different way. Like, hey, can I be an entrepreneur and still take care of myself? And that's how I came across people like that I've shared with you in this community, like Octavia Rahim and her book Gather, and the NAP ministry, the NAP bishop, Trisha Hersey, and Rest is Resistance is her book. Like, these are remarkable, highly successful people that are not willing to compromise their well-being. And I want that role model, please. Like, yes, sign me up for that, because this perfectionist tendency thing that I've learned and lived for a long time, it's not serving me anymore. So who are your role models? Who are you? What are you consuming? Are you look at who you follow on social media? Are those things that are supporting you right now in terms of unhooking from your own perfectionist tendencies, or are they exacerbating it? Notice that. Notice who you're spending time with. Notice who you're hanging out with. Notice where you're choosing to invest your time and energy. Um, And when you play around with the idea of what would happen if I relaxed my standards, do a cost benefit analysis. If you're really scared, if you're like, I can't possibly lower my standards, it's too scary, do a cost benefit analysis. Okay, if I don't check this email 5 times before I send it for typos, I might have some typos and that might make me look silly in front of this person. Now, maybe if it was a job interview email, maybe I would check it 5 times. But if it's like my mom or somebody, like, it's okay for me to not check it 5 times. I don't have to do it perfect. So I'm going to do a cost benefit analysis of like, here are the costs that I'll have to pay if I'm not keeping the standards as their usual super high standards. And here's the benefits. I might get a little bit more of my time back. I might be a little less stressed today. I might get some practice feeling a little bit more relaxed, not so hard on myself. My inner critic will get quieter, et cetera, et cetera. A cost benefit analysis can help you find your edge. You don't want to go over your edge. If you try to demand too much of yourself, there's a way you can just add more fuel to the fire. Sometimes when I would have students come to my yoga classes who were trying to work, whether they recognized it or not, in some way they were maybe trying to work on relaxing the rigidity of their perfectionist tendencies. And then they would come to the class and spend an hour finding the perfect mat and the perfect outfit to wear. And then would create a whole other level of anxiety of, oh my God, am I doing that pose right? She looked like she was doing it better than I was. And this guy was doing it this way over here. And there was a runway for them to learn how to, hey, don't bring the perfectionist tendencies into the strategy that you're trying to use to get out of those tendencies. So, but that takes time. So rather than making ourselves wrong for doing that, just recognize those tendencies are very sneaky. They're going to try to sneak in all the ways. Like, am I resting right? Am I doing this yoga right? Am I relaxing right? Am I meditating right? Don't let yourself get into that battle. And if you do notice yourself in that kind of conversation, press pause. And a place where you might want to start is working on like gratitudes and victories, cataloging your victories each day. Little victories, I call it. Hey, I didn't check that email again, or hey, I let myself have that yoga class and I didn't once look in the mirror and I just was okay with doing it my way, or whatever it is. Like, those little victories are big victories. They're not little as in insignificant. They're little in as society's not going to honor them. And so it has to start within. We have to honor them ourselves. We have to say, that was important. That little slight change I made and how I showed up there, that was really significant. And I honor myself for that. So honoring yourself, but also being grateful for the changes that you are making. Those are 2 antidotes to that perfectionist toxicity that can come up. Okay, I know I started a little late, so I'm just going to go look over my notes one last time and see if there's anything else I want to share with all of you. It's funny because it's dark in the room because I turned the light off and it's kind of thundering outside, so it feels very spooky right now in here. Hopefully the electricity is going to stay connected for us. Okay. Sometimes it can help to think of a question like, how might someone else act if they were in this situation? Again, those role models, like, remember I was pulling away from super ambitious role models and starting to look at people that were doing it different. I would sometimes ask myself, what might they do in this situation? Not from a place of comparativeness, but from a place of widening my perspective of what's possible. That could be a helpful question to ask. Sometimes focusing on the big picture, pulling back, can help if you're getting into one of those, no, everything's got to be perfect. Pulling back and saying, is it really that big of a deal if all the napkins don't match? Or is it really that big of a deal if, this hair is out of place, or whatever the thing is? Pulling back to the bigger picture and asking yourself from that 30,000 foot perspective, does this little minute detail that I'm getting perfectionist about really matter? That can be a helpful skill sometimes as well. We already talked about taking baby steps to widening your window of tolerance. It might be things like, I used to be really, I'm still a little anal about this, showing up to things like 15 minutes early. And if you're not, that's rude and awful and you're a bad person. And it's like, okay, hold up. It's good to be on time. That is absolutely a goal I want to set. And there might be some times where I'm running 5 minutes late. If that happens, I'm going to text the person and apologize and say why and da 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 da. So I have like more tolerance for that. But, 20 years ago, that was not acceptable. Like, no, you are not late. It's not even tolerated. Like, you're 15 minutes early and that's it. So I'm going to slowly start, pulling away from that rigidity and giving myself little baby steps to build up the tolerance. Yeah, I think there's other little ones here, but we've covered these as well. The only other thing I'll say here, last little tip here that could be helpful, is perfectionism can lead to that sort of incessant, relentless, always needing to do more. And it's likely, if you're struggling a lot with perfectionist tendencies, that your schedule is chock full, like probably ridiculously so. I did that for many years. This is a sad yet true story. I kid you not. One day I'll write, maybe I'll I'll share this more publicly in some way. I struggled a lot in New York when I lived there a long time ago with working all the time. Even though I was doing work I loved, yoga and coaching, I was still working literally around the clock. I was working with nursing staff at hospitals, for example, but on all 3 shifts. The graveyard shift, I was doing yoga classes at 1 a.m, and then I'd have clients at 6 a.m. and yada, yada. I mean, it was utterly ridiculous what I was doing. And I knew it. And so I got to this place where I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to a Workaholics Anonymous meeting. And I went, and there was like a moderator or person who organized it. And she said, yeah, come on by. Here's the address, blah, blah, blah. And I went and nobody was there. And then I got an email from her and she wrote, sorry, I got backed up at work. And so I was like, oh my gosh, there's no hope for me. Like, even the Workaholics Anonymous group, like, it was just one of these moments. It was one of those sliding door moments in my life of just like, all right, this is problematic and I'm going to need to go. I'm going to need to find a place where I can get the support I need. But I laugh at that, not laughing at that woman, but more at this idea, like, these things are so prevalent, these perfectionist tendencies, that we don't even question them. They're so part of our world that we don't even question them. And we got to stop that. If my 5-year-old daughter was having, and I'm not a person who pushes perfectionism at home at all, but if she's having that and she's learning to write numbers and freaking out, that's an indicator to me, like, we live in a fishbowl where perfectionism is really pushed on us. So we have to be very discerning to choose a different way of perceiving. And that takes effort, but it's the good kind of effort. It's the right kind of hard. So, and hopefully you got a good laugh out of the Workaholics Anonymous meeting. It was, I think after that I pursued another therapist after that, and was like, you know what, I need to find someone who's going to help me out of this. And thank goodness I did. That's it for now. That feels complete for me right now in this space and in this time. I'm grateful for you being here. I'm grateful for the ways you show up in your authenticity in this space. If you're still experiencing some nervousness around showing up in this space, that's okay. It's a new space. It's a new way of relating with people. I encourage you to take your baby steps. Maybe post a comment somewhere. Maybe share a post, share a like, come to one of our live streams. Give yourself little baby steps in this space, which we can use as a little laboratory for the outer world to grow and explore in a new way. I honor all of you for being here, and I'm so grateful, truly, deeply grateful for all of your support. Have a blessed and beautiful day wherever you are. Be well.